Listen well, to a story that happened when the moon was young and villages still trusted too easily. There was a girl named Zainab who lived where the drums sang every evening and the marketplace buzzed with gentle laughter. She was kind-hearted and careful, the sort who helped elderly neighbors and never spoke harshly. At the stroke of midnight on a warm summer evening, Zainab accepted a ring from a man the whole village adored. He was a performer who brought healing, music, and celebration wherever he walked. Everyone called him blessed, but the moment that silver band touched her finger, it burned cold as winter stone. The metal gripped her skin like tiny teeth, refusing to slide off no matter how she twisted and pulled. Most strange of all, the village drums, which had beaten steadily for 3 generations, stopped mid-rhythm as if the very air was listening. Zainab looked at her hand in the moonlight. Dark shadows stretched toward her fingers like reaching claws. "If only I knew who was really proposing," she whispered, and her words echoed strangely in the sudden silence. When morning came, the village erupted in celebration. Women gathered at the well, chattering excitedly about the engagement. Children ran through the streets singing songs about the blessed performer who had chosen their Zainab. The elders nodded approvingly, praising his wisdom and kindness. Long lines formed outside his tent as people sought his services. Healing for the sick, blessings for newborns, songs for weddings. The village chief himself publicly declared it an honor that such a holy man would remain among them through marriage. Nobody asked Zainab how she felt. They simply congratulated her, patting her shoulders and exclaiming how fortunate she was. Some even said she looked pale with happiness, though that wasn't happiness tightening her chest. The strangest thing happened when someone spoke his name aloud. Each time the syllables filled the air, the ring tightened slightly around her finger, as if it recognized something she couldn't understand. By evening, her finger had begun to throb. Zainab smiled politely at the well-wishers, but inside, questions grew like thorns. The next morning, Zainab went to wash her hands at the river. The sun stood high overhead, casting everything in bright golden light. But when she looked down at the ring, it reflected moonlight, pale, silver, and cold, as if night lived trapped inside the metal. She lifted her wet hand to examine it closer and froze. Her reflection in the water moved just a heartbeat behind her actual movements. When she raised her hand, the reflection followed a moment later. When she turned her head, the watery image lagged like an echo. Fear prickled along her spine. She jerked her hand away from the water and hid it quickly in her dress folds, heart hammering. People passed by on the riverbank path, greeting her cheerfully, noticing nothing wrong. As she hurried home, a single drumbeat sounded from the direction of the market square, one deep, resonant thump that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. Then silence returned, heavier than before. Zainab quickened her pace, the ring growing colder with each step. That evening, worry gnawed at Zainab like hunger. She decided to follow the performer to see where he went after the crowds dispersed. Keeping a careful distance, she trailed him through the winding village paths as dusk painted the sky purple. He walked with purpose toward the forest edge, his steps steady and sure. But when Zainab crept close enough to see clearly, his footprints simply ended. Not at a tree or rock or stream, they just stopped, as if he had dissolved into the air itself. The forest around her grew unnaturally still. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled, no nightbirds called. Even her own breathing seemed too loud in the thick silence. Then she heard his voice, warm and melodic, speaking words she couldn't quite understand. But when she peered through the bushes toward the sound, she saw no one. The voice came from empty air, floating among the trees like smoke. Zainab backed away slowly, her pulse racing. The ring had grown so cold it hurt, spreading an ache up her entire arm. That night, Zainab dreamed of a wedding ceremony. She stood in a white dress before an altar decorated with flowers and candles, holding hands with a groom whose face was completely blank. Smooth skin where features should have been. The faceless man placed a ring on her finger, and in the dream, the metal band spoke her name in a voice like grinding stones. Zainab, it whispered, Zainab, Zainab, until the sound filled her skull and drowned out everything else. She tried to scream, tried to run, tried to remove the ring, but her body wouldn't obey. The faceless groom tilted his empty head as if listening to something she couldn't hear. When she woke, she was clutching her ringed hand to her chest, breathless and damp with sweat. Early morning light filtered through her window, but the ring felt colder than it had the night before. The metal seemed to pulse against her skin like a second heartbeat. Zainab sat up slowly, afraid to look at her hand. When she finally did, the ring appeared darker somehow, as if shadows lived inside the silver. The next day, a sick child was brought to the performer's tent. The little boy burned with fever, barely conscious in his mother's arms. The whole village gathered to watch, praying for a miracle. The performer placed gentle hands on the child's forehead and spoke words in a language none of them recognized. Light seemed to flow from his fingertips, warm and golden. Within moments, the fever broke. The boy opened clear, bright eyes and asked for water in a strong voice. The crowd erupted in amazed cheers. People wept with joy, calling the performer blessed, holy, a gift from heaven. Their faith transformed into something deeper, pure devotion. They looked at him the way flowers turn toward the sun. But when the applause began, sharp pain shot through Zainab's ringed finger and up her arm. She gasped and doubled over, clutching her hand. The ring felt like a burning coal against her skin. Nobody noticed her distress. They were too busy celebrating the miracle, praising the man who would soon be her husband. Their voices rose in grateful song while Zainab stood alone in her agony, the ring pulsing with each clap and cheer. Alone in her room that night, Zainab carefully examined the ring by candlelight. She had to know what bound her so cruelly. Turning the band slowly around her finger, she discovered symbols carved into the inner surface. An eye with spiral pupils, a knot that seemed to twist deeper the longer she looked, and a spiral that appeared to move in the flickering light. As she breathed on the ring, trying to see the markings more clearly, they shifted and changed before her eyes. The eye blinked, the knot tightened, the spiral spun faster. Fear crawled up her throat like a living thing. These weren't decorations, they were something alive, something watching. The symbols moved with purpose, responding to her presence. Then one symbol began to bleed faint light, a soft red glow like a dying ember. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing slightly brighter with each thump. Zainab yanked her hand away from the candle and pressed it against her chest. The light continued to pulse through her dress, marking time like a countdown to something terrible. Desperate for answers, Zainab sought out Grandmother Khadija, the village's oldest herbalist. The ancient woman lived alone in a cottage filled with dried plants and old knowledge. Her eyes were cloudy with age, but she saw things others missed. When Zainab showed her the ring, Grandmother Khadija leaned close for a brief moment, then jerked back as if stung. Her wrinkled hands shook slightly. "Child," the old woman whispered, "let me see that ring again." But when Zainab extended her hand a second time, Grandmother Khadija refused to touch it. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped away. "Listen carefully," she said in a voice like autumn leaves. "That ring binds to what asked for you, not who you saw propose. Do you understand? What you saw was only the messenger." Zainab's blood turned to ice water. "How'd I break it?" The old woman's cloudy eyes filled with sorrow. "Breaking it costs more than wearing it, child. Much more than you know." Over the following days, Zainab began watching the other villagers, especially those who had received special attention from the performer in recent months. What she discovered made her stomach twist with fear. Old Malik, who had been blessed for his failing sight, now moved through the village like a man walking in a dream. His eyes remained open, but they reflected nothing. Sarah, the young mother whose voice had been healed, spoke in whispers and started at every sound. Little Ahmed, cured of his limp, walked perfectly but never smiled anymore. Each person the performer had helped seemed diminished somehow, as if part of them had been quietly taken. They all moved through their daily lives, but something essential was missing: their laughter, their curiosity, their spark of life. Most disturbing was the pattern Zainab noticed. Each person had received their gift at midnight, just as she had received her ring. And in every case, there was one name whispered in connection to their condition, a name spoken so quietly she could barely hear it. Unable to sleep, Zainab crept to her mother's old mirror in the dead of night. She needed to understand what was happening to her reflection. Holding a candle with trembling hands, she faced the glass with her ringed hand uncovered. The reflection that stared back wore the ring on a hand that seemed darker, more shadowed than her own. When Zainab moved her fingers, the reflection's fingers followed, but the ring in the mirror gleamed with an inner light that her actual ring didn't possess. Then something impossible happened. The reflection smiled while Zainab's own face remained frightened and serious. The mirror Zainab's lips curved upward in satisfaction, as if pleased by some private joke. Zainab stumbled backward, nearly dropping the candle. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and from its depths came a whispered name, ancient, foreign, full of power. The name hit her ears like a physical blow, and she understood with horrible clarity that this was the real name of what had claimed her. Not the performer's name, which was only a mask. The mirror fell silent, reflecting only her terrified face. The next morning, Zainab gathered her courage and approached the village elders as they sat under the great tree discussing community matters. Her heart hammered as she tried to explain what she had experienced, the cold ring, the strange reflection, the pattern among the healed villagers. But the elders' faces hardened as she spoke. The eldest, a man with a gray beard, held up his hand to silence her. "Enough," he said sternly. "These are the words of fear and envy, child. You speak against a holy man who brings only blessings to our people." The other elders nodded gravely. They accused her of jealousy, of being too young to understand such sacred matters. When word reached the performer, he appeared quickly, his face gentle with concern. He approached Zainab with kindness, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder before the gathered crowd. "Fear before marriage is natural," he said in his warm, melodic voice. "I will pray for peace to fill her heart." The villagers murmured approval. The ring pulsed against Zainab's finger, warm and pleased, as if feeding on their misplaced trust. That night, desperate to free herself, Zainab built a small fire in her room and held her ringed hand over the flames. If the ring was evil, perhaps fire could cleanse it away. She lowered her hand toward the dancing orange light. The flame died the instant the ring came near it, snuffed out as if the metal had swallowed the fire whole. Immediately, searing pain shot up Zainab's arm like liquid lightning, so intense she bit her lip to keep from screaming. When the agony finally faded, she noticed something that made her heart stop. Her shadow on the wall no longer matched her position. She stood facing forward, but her shadow was turned sideways, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The ring had grown heavier too, so heavy her arm ached from its weight. Whatever force lived inside the metal was growing stronger, fed by her fear and the village's continued trust in its servant. Days, nightmares began rippling through the village like a disease. Children woke screaming from dreams of faceless dancers who spun around them in endless circles. Adults reported visions of shadows that moved independently of their owners. The marketplace grew quieter. People hurried through their daily tasks with nervous glances over their shoulders. Even the animals seemed uneasy. Dogs whimpered without cause, and horses shied at empty spaces. But instead of questioning their beloved performer, the villagers turned to him for comfort. They begged him to banish whatever evil had come among them, and he, with great ceremony, announced that a grand festival would be held to cleanse the spiritual darkness from their community. At midnight on the feast of the full moon, he proclaimed, "We will drive out all fear and doubt with celebration and prayer." The crowd cheered, but Zainab felt ice form in her veins. The ring had grown almost unbearably heavy, and she understood with growing horror that the festival would peak at exactly midnight, the same hour when all his other blessings had been given. Unable to bear her isolation any longer, Zainab returned to Grandmother Cottage's cottage. She found the old herbalist sitting by her fire, staring into the flames as if reading secrets in the dancing light. "You've come back," the old woman said without turning around. "Good. There are things you must know." Grandmother Cottage's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She told Zainab that one other woman had worn such a ring, many years ago when Khadija herself was young. The woman had been clever and brave, and somehow she had survived what Zainab now faced. But survival came with a price, the herbalist said sadly. She lost her voice that night and could never speak of what she learned. The curse demanded silence in exchange for freedom. Zainab leaned forward eagerly. Where is she now? Can I find her? The old woman shook her head. She disappeared the morning after. Some say she died. Others whisper she still walks among us, watching and waiting. Grandmother Khadija finally turned to meet Zainab's eyes. But no one knows for certain where she went. For 3 days, Zainab searched everywhere: abandoned huts on the village outskirts, quiet riverbanks where few people wandered, forgotten paths through the forest. She asked questions carefully, seeking any trace of a woman who might have vanished decades ago. But as she searched, she began to notice signs that someone had been watching her. Footprints in soft earth that matched her own size. Broken branches at head height marking a path. Small stones arranged in patterns that seemed almost like messages. Meanwhile, the festival preparations intensified. Drums began rehearsing rhythms that made her teeth ache, and decorations appeared overnight as if placed by invisible hands. The performer moved through it all with serene confidence, blessing the preparations with touches that made the very air shimmer. The ring grew heavier with each passing hour. By the third evening, Zainab could barely lift her arm. The weight was becoming unbearable, dragging at her like an anchor determined to pull her down into dark depths. She had to find the first victim soon, or the festival would claim her completely. During evening prayers, when the village gathered in the square and bowed their heads in unison, a figure stepped quietly from the shadows. A woman in a dark veil approached the edge of the crowd and stood perfectly still, waiting. Zainab noticed her first. Something about the woman's stillness was different from prayer, more like watchfulness. When the prayers ended and people began to disperse, the veiled woman remained. Slowly, she lifted her hands and pulled away the veil that covered her face. Gasps echoed across the square. Her skin bore terrible scars, twisted marks that looked like writing in a language of pain. Most shocking of all, when she opened her mouth to speak, no sound emerged. The woman was voiceless, just as Grandmother Khadija had said. Before anyone could react, the scarred woman knelt in the dust and began writing with her finger. Her message appeared in the dirt in shaky letters. I survived by refusing the last vow. Zainab's heart leapt with desperate hope. Finally, someone who understood. Someone who had escaped. The ring pulsed against her finger like a captured heartbeat, and she knew her time was running short. In the privacy of Zainab's room, the scarred woman used gestures and scratched words to explain what Zainab needed to know. Her movements were urgent, desperate, as if time itself were running out like sand through fingers. The ritual to break the curse was precise and unforgiving. 3 things had to align perfectly at the moment of greatest power: the correct time, the true name of the entity that claimed souls, and the exact place where the binding began. The woman held up one finger, then made a slashing motion across her throat. One mistake, and the binding became permanent. Forever. But the most terrible requirement was that the ritual had to be performed publicly, before witnesses. The entity fed on deception and shadows. Only truth spoken before the community could break its hold. The scarred woman gripped Zainab's shoulders with shaking hands and looked directly into her eyes. Through gestures, she conveyed a warning that chilled Zainab to her core. The entity would not release one soul without trying to claim another. Breaking free meant someone else might take her place. The ring seemed to grow colder as the woman shared these secrets, as if it understood and disapproved of the knowledge being passed along. The festival preparations took on a frenzied pace as midnight approached. Banners and decorations blocked access routes throughout the village, including the path to the river where Zainab had first noticed her strange reflection. Workers seemed to appear from nowhere, arranging everything according to the performer's detailed instructions. Zainab realized with growing alarm that the performer was deliberately controlling the festival's timing. Events that should have taken place at sunset were delayed to evening. Evening activities were pushed toward night. Everything was being drawn inexorably toward midnight, like a great web contracting around its prey. Even time itself seemed to move strangely. Minutes crawled by like hours when she was alone, but when she wasn't paying attention, whole hours vanished in what felt like moments. The closer they came to midnight, the more chaotic time became. The drums had begun their final rhythm, a complex pattern that seemed designed to confuse the mind and pull at something deeper than hearing. With each beat, the ring grew heavier and colder. Zainab understood that the festival was not meant to drive evil away, but to complete whatever binding the ring had begun. As the full moon reached its peak and midnight approached, the entire village gathered in the great circle at the heart of the square. Torches cast dancing shadows on the faces of the crowd, and the drums built to a crescendo that seemed to shake the earth itself. Zainab stepped forward into the center of the circle, her heart hammering with terror and determination. The performer smiled encouragingly at her, gesturing for her to join him for what the crowd believed would be a blessing ceremony. But instead of approaching him, Zainab turned to face the entire village and spoke in a voice that carried over the drums. "I call upon Malphaz, the builder of towers, the keeper of false promises." The true name hit the air like lightning striking stone. The performer's smile cracked and began to fall away like a mask. His eyes widened with something that might have been surprise or might have been fury. The ring on Zainab's finger suddenly ignited with brilliant white light that made everyone shield their eyes. The drums stuttered and fell silent. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was Zainab's racing heartbeat. What happened next would be whispered about for generations. The performer's shadow began to separate from his body, peeling away like old paint in the flickering torchlight. But while his shadow moved with purpose and malice, the man himself remained calm, almost empty, as if he were nothing more than a vessel that had suddenly been drained. The shadow that rose from the ground was massive, towering over the crowd with wings like tattered darkness and eyes that burned with ancient hunger. This was the true entity that had been hidden behind the performer's gentle face. Most terrifying of all, the shadow turned and bowed deeply to the ring on Zainab's finger, acknowledging its true master. The ring had summoned this demon, not the other way around. The performer had been nothing but a puppet, a pretty face to hide what was really asking for souls. With a shriek that shattered windows and made children scream, the shadow lunged toward Zainab. Its claws reached for her throat, aiming to silence the voice that had spoken its true name. But the ring's light held it back, creating a barrier of blazing white that the shadow could not cross. The scarred woman suddenly collapsed at the edge of the circle, her body convulsing as if struck by lightning. As she fell, something miraculous and terrible happened. Her voice returned. For the first time in decades, sound emerged from her scarred throat. But she could speak only one word before her strength failed completely. That single word rang out across the square with the power of absolute truth: liar. The shadow reeled as if struck by a physical blow. The ring on Zainab's finger cracked down its center with a sound like breaking bones, but it did not shatter completely. Ancient power fought against itself, creation and destruction locked in battle. The crowd pressed backward in terror, but they could not look away. They finally saw what had been hidden among them for so long, not a holy man bringing blessings, but an ancient evil that fed on their faith and trust. But the curse was not finished. It resisted dying with the fury of something that had survived for centuries by feeding on human weakness. The ring's crack began to seal itself, the light growing dimmer. The shadow regained its strength and reached for the nearest children. Even as the ring cracked, another symbol inside the band suddenly activated, one that Zainab had not noticed before. This new marking blazed with red light, and the ring split further but refused to break completely. The shadow, realizing that Zainab might escape its hold, abandoned its attempt to claim her. Instead, it reached toward the crowd with claws that dripped darkness. Its target was clear: the children standing frozen in terror at the circle's edge. One by one, the youngest villagers began to freeze in place, their eyes growing blank and distant. The entity had decided that if it could not keep its chosen bride, it would claim replacements, as many souls as it could gather before the ring finally shattered. The scarred woman tried to rise, tried to speak again, but her single word had cost her everything. She lay motionless, her brief voice spent. Zainab watched in horror as the children's faces grew empty, their personalities draining away like water from a broken bowl. She had to act quickly, or her escape would cost the village its future. The ring pulsed with malevolent heat, fighting against the crack that threatened to destroy it completely. In that moment of desperate clarity, Zainab realized a truth that changed everything. The man standing empty-eyed in the circle had never proposed to her at all. He couldn't have, he was only a shell, a puppet with no will of his own. The ring itself had done the proposing, using the performer's face and voice to speak words that bound souls. The entity called Malphas was not some distant demon, it lived inside the ring, and the ring was what had summoned the shadow to feed. The ring chose its own bearer. Zainab shouted to the crowd. It summoned him as bait, used him as a mask. He was only a vessel. Understanding rippled through the crowd like wildfire. They had been worshipping an empty shell while the real predator hid in plain sight, wrapped around Zainab's finger. But even as the truth spread, the ring fought back with desperate fury. It began to glow with heat that burned Zainab's finger, trying to force her into silence. The shadow reached for her with renewed strength, determined to stop her voice. The ring's demand was simple and terrible. Choose a new bearer from among the crowd, or watch everyone perish. Zainab took a deep breath and spoke the final, most dangerous truth. I name thee by thy origin and thy end. Thou art Malphas, forged in greed and hatred, bound by Solomon's seal, broken by Solomon's wisdom. She had remembered the old stories grandmother Khadijah told, tales of wise kings who bound demons in objects of power. The ring was not just cursed. It was a prison, and she had found the words that could shatter its bars. The shadow let out a wail that shattered every piece of glass in the village. But instead of fighting, it began to dissolve, pulled back into whatever dark realm had birthed it. The ancient binding that held it in the world was finally breaking. The ring cracked completely down its length, then shattered into pieces of silver that fell like rain onto the dusty ground. Each fragment turned to ash before it could touch the earth. Silence fell over the village like a blanket. The children blinked and looked around in confusion, their personalities flooding back like returning spring. The frozen adults began to move again. Then, finally, people began to breathe, deep, grateful breaths of air that tasted clean for the first time in months. Dawn came softly to the village, painting the sky in gentle shades of pink and gold. The drums, which had been silent since that first midnight, began a slow, peaceful rhythm as people emerged from their homes to help clear away the festival decorations. The scarred woman sat up slowly, a peaceful smile spreading across her marked face for the first time in decades. Though her voice was gone again, the terrible weight of enforced silence had lifted. She was free to choose her own quiet. The village elders gathered to rewrite their traditions, ensuring that no one would again trust so blindly, no matter how kind a stranger appeared or how wonderful their gifts seemed. Children would learn to question what glittered, to look beneath the surface of things that seemed too good to be true. As for the performer, he sat in the circle's center, blinking slowly as awareness returned to eyes that had been empty for years. He remembered nothing of his time as a vessel, and perhaps that was a mercy. Zainab looked at her bare finger where the ring had been and whispered the words that would end the story. If only they had known who was really proposing, they would have listened sooner. The village learned to trust again, but more carefully, and they lived wisely ever after.